A year and a half of weekly counseling. Occasionally, I need to come back for more. 210 hours. 210 hours of self-exploration, including books, online articles, forum discussions, and mirror scripts.
57 hours.
57 hours of narrative therapy and art therapy. 345 hours. 345 hours of meditation. 767 hours. 767 hours of self-care, including crying in a blanket, warm baths, talking to a friend, watching films, reading books, writing, singing, swimming, and riding a bike.
40 hours.
40 hours of Krav Maga. Hours left to complete recovery? Uncountable.
A gentleman was passing by. He asked for a drink as he got dry. At the well below the valley, oh, green grows a lily, oh, right among the bushes, oh.
There are things that happen in your life that scar you forever.
Uraz. To może być uraz emocjonalny albo każdy inny, tak, seksualny, jakieś nadużycie czy przemoc, ale również uraz emocjonalny, czyli porzucenie, niezaspokojenie potrzeb dziecka.
Very big event in the life of the person, usually in the negative sense. When we think of trauma, we don't think of exciting good things, we think of extremely negative things.
Somebody might have, physical symptoms like headache, sweaty palms, heart palpitations, and rapid breathing. They could have stomach aches. They could have butterflies in their stomach and being nauseous. They could have repeated images in their head, not understanding why they are feeling scared. They can be dissociated. They can, withdraw in themselves. They can become suicidal. They can become aggressive towards other people, depressed, hyper-aroused. Some people deal with trauma by becoming maybe humorous and using that humor in a really inappropriate way. Lots of different things.
If it's not worked with, or that person hasn't done anything about it, it'll continue happening. It'll just continue. That trauma will still be affecting that individual or that family or that community.
If you are lucky and hardworking, you heal the wounds up and carry a hidden scar. The scar may open again from time to time, but most of the time you live knowing the scar is there, even if it's not bleeding. You may learn to deal with it, care for it, and prevent it from opening, but it's something you never forget and never quite detach from.
Essentially, sex abuse or child sex abuse is enticing a child to engage in some kind of sexual activity that is not really known by the child, or really not realizing what the child is getting into, and it's crossing boundaries.
Child sexual abuse is one person or anybody taking advantage of a child
for their own sexual pleasure, whether it's touching, showing pornographic material, reading erotica, looking at kids and having them undress and taking pictures of little kids and using that for sexual gratification. Having said that, that's not the sexual gratification, it's another need that's being met by the perpetrator.
No to jest dotykanie dziecka w sposób seksualny dla własnej gratyfikacji. No. To nie musi być penetracja oralna, analna czy genitalna, ale to może być również obnażanie się przed dzieckiem, tak uwodzenie go. Są nadużycia bezdotykowe, które polegają tak naprawdę na kontakcie między dorosłą osobą a dzieckiem, który to kontakt jest niewłaściwy ze względu na seksualną postawę dorosłego.
One thing I was requested to do in my counseling was to write my family story. I did more than that. I went to visit some relatives and hear their stories, to touch old pictures and eat homemade strawberry cake while listening to difficult truths and secrets that were kept away from me and never discussed. I set out on a journey to see how my family was affected and how it reacted to my abuse. But instead, I received an understanding of how their abuse and their dysfunctions affected me.
To jest powielanie pewnych wzorców. Nie wiem, manipulująca, niedojrzała matka w taki sam sposób prawdopodobnie była traktowana przez swoją matkę, jakby wykształciła pewne metody zachowań, przeniesie to na swoją córkę. Tak długo jak ktoś w jednym pokoleniu, jedna osoba nie pójdzie na terapię, tak te metody postępowania, czy te zachowania, czy te sposoby reagowania będą przekazywane z pokolenia na pokolenie. I w ten sam sposób są przekazywane jakby takie wzorce jak brak granic, rozseksualizowanie i kazirodztwo również w sumie. Przemoc.
Abuse is a cycle and that it goes from one generation to the next.
I think for us, for First Nations people, it's called historical trauma.
Okay.
And it's all the trauma that we've experienced since the coming of the Europeans, because a lot of the things that happened to us historically has really changed our lives, you know, with the, I guess with the government, placing us on reserves and taking away our culture and our language through the residential schools. So for us, that's what the historical trauma means. Mm-hmm. The intergenerational trauma is the trauma that has affected our grandparents and great-grandparents and, and our grandparents, our parents, and, right up to my generation, and could be my children too.
In search of understanding, I am visiting my aunt. I get to know quite a lot of my family's history from this heartwarming visit. I see places where my family's houses might have been in the past. Even though it is a bit scary to dig out difficult truths, I know this is not about only me and my partner anymore. It is about a tiny human being who will appear soon in our lives. This is my story. Or, actually, my family's story. This is me. This is my mum.
My first abuser.
I don't know her story. I wish I had. Research says that women who become molesters most likely went through violent sexual abuse in their early years. With all the pain her behavior caused, it would be easier to know her story. Not to excuse, but to understand. There are some things that might suggest she was abused, but she never admitted it. When it comes to my mom's side, I know quite a bit, but a lot of it is also only my interpretation. Let's go back in time to my great-grandma. She married her first husband very young to escape a strict home. Her first husband came from a family prone to conflicts, which also followed my great-grandfather into his marriage. They fought continuously. My great-grandfather was possibly suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a war veteran and was described as a nervous type. He was incredibly controlling and jealous, and often threatened great-granny that he would kill her if he saw her with anyone else. My grandfather died in vague circumstances involving a fight with his wife and a revolver. There are at least 3 different versions of the story. My great-grandma married again and soon had to run away from her second husband, who occurred to be an abusive alcoholic. My great-grandma had 2 children, my granny and her sister. She could not support her little daughters. The girls were left in a crowded place while she went to bring them sweets. They were picked up by services and placed in an orphanage. They spent a few months there before being moved to another location. The orphanage was governed by nuns in civil clothes. Heavy corporal punishment was exercised daily, including group responsibility for the slightest offense. during the holidays some children were forced to beg, while staff's tables were plentiful with food and the children were given scraps. The girls spent about 9 years in the orphanage before their mother could afford to take them back. 2 years later, the Second World War broke out, leaving the 3 of them in a turmoil of bombarding, shootings, hiding in cellars, and finally, occupation. All 3 changed jobs a few times, but one story raised my suspicions especially. My grandma, as a 15-year-old girl, was spotted by the manager of a company in which they were all employed at one point, and worked in the office rather than physically. She was then offered a job at the manager's house, a job she didn't want to take. She was crying and begging her mother not to force her, but was sent there anyway. She worked there for only a month or so, after which she completely refused to go there. My guess is that she was in some way molested by the manager. Not long after this episode, my grandma was arrested, along with a whole shift at the post office where she worked. After a few weeks, all of the prisoners, apart from one girl, are sent to concentration camps in Auschwitz. She spent almost 3 years there witnessing rats eating people who died at night and stealing food from people's hands. Constant hunger and fear in the shadow of a gigantic chimney of the crematorium where the Nazis burned people. At the end of the war, prisoners were moved to the concentration camp in Dachau. On their way home, my granny joined a group of women. They encountered Russian soldiers who raped all of them, apart from my grandma, who, according to the perpetrator, looked too appalling to be the target of violation. I believe that her sister also experienced rape. She definitely witnessed young girls being picked daily and brutally raped by Ukrainian soldiers who cooperated with the Nazis. I don't know much about their stories after the war was over. My grandma married and had 2 children, my mother and her brother. I don't know a thing about my mother's dad. The only 2 memories she shared were Sunday mornings in bed playing with him and her brother, and the hospital room in which he died of unknown causes when she was 15. My mum was described by my father's family as manipulative but very likable on the surface. There was an intuitive feeling that there was something wrong with her under the facade. My grandma's sister married and also had 2 children. Her marriage ended with a divorce, and so did one of her sons. Her other son died young, leaving 2 children and his wife behind. I didn't know them well, but when I was younger, the aunt was described to me as conflicting and controlling, whereas my cousins were troubled. There were myriads of situations when both my mother and my mother's close cousin were not respecting the boundaries connected to body and cracking jokes with sexual innuendo in front of teenagers. I was requested not to disclose it, but I was told a story of at least one abusive incident in my mother's cousin's life when he was a child. He brushed it off as normal.
So if a child experiences abuse, whether it be physical, verbal, or sexual, then that's what they grow up with as being normal, or accept as being normal, and then they don't know any other way. And when they have kids, then they treat their kids the same way that they were treated. And then we see the cycle start, or continue, I guess I should say. And then they don't know how to get out of that cycle because they don't know any different.
Nobody wakes up one day and makes a conscious decision that this kind of treatment is okay and I'm going to tolerate this and this is fine.
If you start getting abused as a young child and, you begin to think that's normal, and because you think it's normal, then, when you become a perpetrator, then for you it's normal, and then the child in turn thinks it's normal, and so they do it to somebody else. So it's just a cycle, and it could be passed on from generation to generation.
Let us look at my father's side of the family. My father was the healthier parent. However, for months on end, he didn't notice, and when alerted, refused to act on my abuse. I needed to know why. Apparently, my father, as a young boy, was attacked by a pedophile who attempted rape. He said he narrowly escaped it. I remember him mentioning something very vaguely that could confirm that my dad was unable to heal from this encounter.
Osoba wykorzystywana, która nie przeszła terapii, no to po prostu będzie lgnęła do ludzi, którzy ją krzywdzą, którzy ją będą wykorzystywali. Nie będzie potrafiła postawić granicy, nie będzie potrafiła powiedzieć nie, jakby będzie wierzyła w to, że ta osoba się zmieni, tak będzie wierzyła w jakąś swoją iluzję. Nie będzie potrafiła powiedzieć stop, dosyć, odchodzę.
Because they don't have no coping skills. And again, we go down to the Aboriginal. Because they have no effective coping skills that would produce a positive lifestyle. The coping skills they have are what? Beating their wife, putting down that person, either verbally or physically. That's their coping skills. They have no effective coping skills. So until they're retaught those effective coping skills, it'll continue.
I think if people are willing to seek the help that's out there and to go through that process of working through it themselves, I think it can stop.
My aunt remembers being a victim of molestation twice when she was a child. She survived interpersonal violence for years, in times when getting a divorce and becoming a single mother meant social taunting for her and her children. My aunt was the only person in the family, to my knowledge, that has grown and has been healing from her traumas, anxiety fits, depression, and wounded self-image. This side of the family has depression and anxiety issues coming up time and again. My grandma's father was suffering from depression and tried to commit suicide several times. My grandmother believed that her and her husband's families were ridden with a pathology, alcoholism for one, and was trying to distance herself and my grandfather from them. She is remembered as a person who was manipulative and intentionally lying. Closer to the end of her life, she was crossing some boundaries connected to body. She was also believed to have an aversion to sex. My grandfather was a person I was very fond of. I was surprised to know that he was completely under my grandmother's control, loving her with what seems to be unhealthy love, almost an addiction. It was believed in the family, though, that she simply felt better than the rest of the family. I would not like to get into details about my abuses, but let me tell you that women often abuse children, veiling the abuse into necessary hygiene. I also witnessed sexual intercourses of grown-ups and was exposed to plenty of smaller innuendos, touches, and words that were crossing the line of decency. This was happening over a few years when I was a very little girl. I believe my brother might also have been a victim of child sexual abuse, and I think I saw symptoms of sexualizing of his son. My only guess is that my mother might have crossed the line again. When I was in my early teens, I was manipulated by my mother into a relationship with a much older acquaintance. He was often, in turn, invited to our house or I to his, and we were left alone. After the initial grooming, during which he succeeded to get the affections of the starved-for-love little girl, he slowly started crossing the line, first by talking about sex, then slowly by introducing grown-up kissing and touching until he violated me. My one attempt to break up with him went to nothing. I was again manipulated into being his girlfriend under the watchful eye of my mother and unnoticed by my father. I was initially reasoned with and manipulated by the perpetrator to keep quiet, and later on threatened by death.
There can be situations if there is something that is to be hidden, if you don't want the larger population to know, of course, that you're committing a crime. One of the ways is to make sure that it's hammered home, that everything that happens in this family stays in this family, that you never tell anyone what's going on. Often there's isolation, so there'd be less chance that you would tell someone else what's going on. So those kinds of things certainly can be happening. So if you isolate, it's easier to continue the abuse if there's isolation.
I don't know if it's like an old school generation thing that, family business was to be kept, just within kind of the family walls, and not even that it just wasn't discussed. And that I can see in my personal experience.
I don't really know too much about how deviancy is passed on, but I know one thing. What is really passed on is the inability to talk about anything. It's the term, the conspiracy of silence, that's passed on, from a family dynamic to don't talk about it. Try not to exhibit any feelings on it. Push it down. Suppress the feeling. It's better that way, because if you start bringing out feelings, and if you start questioning things, you're going to create a lot of problems in the family that we have there.
When you speak and talk about whatever is bothering you, that that's a fantastic way of healing. And I think if it's not talked about and it's continued to be internalized, it'll cause that individual harm, and it may even cause them to continue with what happened to them. It's not always the case, but it will cause that child harm, and it'll come out in other ways, like juvenile delinquency, or not attending school, or being very disruptive in all areas, like disrespectful, not exhibiting positive virtues. It'll be all negative.
Until this day, I cannot believe that whole groups and families of witnesses did not find anything unacceptable, or at least weird, about an 11-year-old girl dating an adult.
When I was in residential school too, I never really, thought about the different ways that, people could be sexually abused. Like, when you're a kid, you don't know the definitions of, the different types of sexual abuse. But as when I did my training, when I was training to be a social worker, I had to learn all of the different abuses, that occurred, and I guess for me, I was really surprised and shocked at some of the ways that children and young children and the different genders could be abused, especially boys. I had no idea.
Whenever we're really taught the proper sexuality, and even to this day, there's no training to that effect in the school system about healthy sexuality, healthy relationship building, honoring the opposite sex, and these are ways in which we do it, and the value and the beauty of relationship and sexual relationship and children and all the other stuff. Right? None of that is taught. None of that is taught in the school system.
We're teaching people to be victims, and we're teaching people to be perpetrators in the larger society. When it comes down to individual stuff, yes, they have to take responsibility for what's happened to them on an individual sense. No one forced them to do it. But again, as a society, we have to look at what happened. What have we taught people in the society that these situations continue to exist?
No. Rewind. There were people trying to raise an alarm on my father's side of the family. I got to know about it only lately. Apparently, though, my father was so manipulated by my mother that he told his family members not to interfere and that everything was fine.
You're living in a family dynamic where it's phony, and people feel it. People can feel that phoniness. There's something not right here, but it's okay with me. It's better than rocking the boat and questioning what's going on here. At least we'll keep the peace.
It's a journey of trying to find something better than what they have had, but not really knowing what that looks like, because they cannot rely on their parents or grandparents or their aunts or uncles or to give them the guidance in that direction and that support, because they are all feeling the same way. You come from a traumatized family, and I'm talking grandparents, aunts, uncles, moms, dads, brothers, sisters. The expectation is that if they all existed in trauma, that you will continue to exist in trauma, because that's what it is. So the expectation becomes you will be just like everybody else.
Jeżeli ojciec wykorzystuje córkę, a w rodzinie jest dwoje czy troje dzieci, to te dzieci nieświadomie współpracują, żeby utrzymać tę homeostazę, tę równowagę. No i ta matka współpracuje, co jest przerażające, ale niestety tak funkcjonują rodziny kazirodcze.
Eventually, it was my father who helped to get me out of this situation after 2 long years. However, the words abuse never entered our conversation. I was never offered psychological help. The subject just didn't exist at all. I was 13 and free from my abuser, and I didn't know yet that I was on my way to hell. Years later, I realized I had post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting itself with depression, invasive thoughts about abuse, panic fits, unexplainable body pains, withdrawal from social life, high stress levels, sleeping disorders, sex aversion, suicidal thoughts, and more, for years on end. It's interesting to see how patterns of controlling, lack of boundaries, and sexual abuse travels down. How my family members would choose abusive, manipulating, or controlling partners. How I would choose my first boyfriend. Our relationship was very abusive from both ends. And it's interesting to see how with healing, I started to choose wiser and managed to escape the unhealthy relationships. I tried counseling quite a few times between the ages 17 to 27, but only when I was 27 did I meet my savior. With her help, I made an incredible progress, and I healed to the extent that allowed me to be not a survivor of child sexual abuse, but a thriver. Then, I decided, came the time to confront my family, as I could not live in a lie anymore. In my encounters with the family after I disclosed my abuses, I was repeatedly told to forget about it, drop it. Why drag it out now? How can you trouble your mother like this? It was suggested on more than one occasion that you wanted to be abused, you liked it. You asked for it. You would go into a room with him and close the door.
It's kind of the society that we live in where you fend for yourself and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and if you don't do that, you're lazy, and if you didn't get ahead, it's because you're lazy, and all these things.
Instead of looking at the larger picture of why there is inequality in the society, it's often easier to blame the victims. Instead of the larger society to take responsibility about the society and what's going on. So, I mean, we've got classism in the larger society, we have racism, we have sexism, we have homophobia. There's certainly inequality in many spheres, and they all play together to, again, instead of having more equality in all areas, it's much easier just to turn around and do poor bashing, for instance.
There are still so many questions I have. Was sexual violence normalized in my family? Was lack of education the reason that it was left unseen? Was the family unit so important that instead of exposing the violence, it was more important to maintain the homeostasis through secrecy? Was the secrecy in society fueling the lack of education? Is the society's way to be blamed for putting the blame on victims? Were the issues with a lack of parenting abilities to blame? And finally, if there had been education on coping skills widely available, would my family have managed to stop the violence earlier? It's possible that more than the sexual abuse, lack of caring and truthful primary caregiver was destructive to me. Dismantling the lies and myths now, it almost feels like my childhood is resting on something that is all made up. Hiding behind a facade of caring and a perfect family is the emotional neglect.
No, jeśli rodzic był wykorzystany, jest nieleczoną ofiarą, no to nawet jeśli dziecko nie jest wykorzystane, no to matka ofiara nie jest w stanie wychować prawidłowo swojego dziecka.
You know, I think a person wasn't taught poor parenting or parenting skills. And if you weren't taught that, how can you teach a child? So it's not passed on. And that child grows up to be an adult, as children themselves, and they in turn haven't been taught parenting skills. How can they teach their children or this person's grandchild parenting skills? That is passed on.
Now that my child is born, I feel I learn mothering from books rather than from my parents. I want to be the last link in this chain of abuses stemming from many different factors. I know it's not about my family only. I need to see the bigger picture. All the children who were abused, and who are abused now, and who will be abused in the future. It's about them as well. It's about all of us. It's about how much we can and should do to stop it.
To the children, it's just to do the best that they can do. I think it takes one very strong person to say, I don't want that to happen again, and or I don't want my children to experience what I've experienced, and it has to be a real conscious effort to make it stop. To the teachers, to just keep in mind that there's usually a lot behind the scenes that they're not aware of, and that we try to do the best that we can, and that we're patient with a lot of these kids, even though on a daily basis it's frustrating or it's heart-wrenching because you feel for these kids. But quite often we always, even as counselors, we don't always know all of the information from what's going on at home or what they've experienced in the past or what trauma they've been through or the family dynamics, those kinds of things. I think if we did know all of the information, we would treat those kids differently, but we don't always have access to that information. So just to love them and to do the best that we can do.
If we as professionals can give hope to kids and let them know that there can be a different way and steer them in certain support directions and always be there for them, be judgment free. Of course anyone can change, and it may rest with that student or his or her generation in the family to put a stop to things. Understanding that there are sometimes really awful things that are going on in homes that might even seem normal to kids or families even, or might be families and kids might be in denial or not even understand certain dynamics. So know your students, have an awareness of some warning signs and build relationships such that you could query, you could have a conversation, maybe ask some questions to react appropriately when students disclose. Responding calmly and quietly and appropriately in that initial moment when that student is opening up. It takes tremendous courage for kids to, families, anything, to say anything, to reach out. So just really respecting and holding very carefully that moment. Yes, the response must be quick as far as professionals are concerned, but in that moment to not really overtake the student with a pile of emotion and create a possibility for them to step back or jump back or close off.
I think people have to be educated. They have to talk about it, and I think there has to be every precaution to make sure that the younger generations are safe.
Right now we're passing down something negative with that intergenerational. With our ancestral teachings, it's all positive. They come gifts, eh? That's what we need to turn around. But in the meantime, we got to combat what's causing those intergenerational trauma.
If you can teach children the right thing, and then sort of try to model good behavior for them, they will learn from that, and they will become better human beings as a result of those teachings. So my work now has focused towards children. If I can teach kids to grow up in a healthy way, I'm changing the nation. So I'm borrowing that apparatus the residential school had, and I'm putting it into my perspective and into my way of living and into my way of teaching. And then if there's anything good I got from the residential school, it was that experience. I could do the same thing they did, but I could do it in a different, better way.
It's slow and it's coming, and we are seeing lots of things change, lots of things remaining the same. But like I said, if we invest in our kids and really build on them, then I think things will really be different in 30 years. And then hopefully what we will build in our kids will have an impact on their kids. And this intergenerational, multi-generational, whatever you want to call it, it will change.
Wykraczające poza normę zachowania dziecka. Jeśli dziecko jest przesadnie wycofane albo przesadnie jakieś zabiegające na przykład o coś, albo agresywne, albo jakieś stłumione, tak? Albo się boi, albo jakoś bardzo reaguje na autorytet nauczycieli, tak? To też może świadczyć o tym, że jest jakoś zastraszone. Boi się rodzica, więc boi się też nauczyciela. Czyli wszystko to, co wykracza poza jakąś normę, czyli względnie normalne dziecko jest czasem aktywne, a czasem trochę klapnięte, średnio uczestniczy, czasem mu się chce, czasem mu się nie chce, jakby tak w pewnej normie się jakieś zachowania mieszczą. Ale w momencie, kiedy one są jakoś nadmierne, zbyt często zaczyna być widać, że dziecko się z nikim nie koleguje na przykład, albo bije inne dzieci, no to są rzeczy, na które trzeba zwrócić uwagę, bo coś się dzieje z dzieckiem, czyli w rodzinie. Koniecznie pracować, jeżeli tylko są jakieś, za dużo jest tych symptomów, tu depresja, tu lęki, tu jakieś, nie wiem, zaburzenia odżywiania, no to na pewno tu problemy w sferze seksualnej, to jeśli tylko pojawia się kilka, to iść na terapię, pracować nad tym i docierać do tego, co się wydarzyło. Bo tylko tą metodą jakby uchronimy własne dzieci i wychowamy je funkcyjniej i zmieniamy świat przez to. Jakby społeczeństwo się zmienia. Im więcej ludzi idzie pracować nad sobą i jakby porządkuje swoje sprawy, no tym większa jest szansa, że będzie więcej dobrych rodziców, świadomych, tak? W związku z czym już następne pokolenie będzie zdrowsze.
I think education is key. I think it's crucial that we start educating from a very young age of respect, dignity, and having the support so that children can know from a very young age if something is going on, something's harmful, that they can talk to someone and something will be done. And that teaching, again from a very young age, what is healthy in terms of healthy relationships, and teaching those kinds of things I think are just as important as teaching the regular school things that are going on. In terms of other people out there, to let them know what services there are there, that help is available. And then in the bigger picture, that we have to continue to work to make the society, lessen the amount of violence in the larger society.
7 years are ringing a bell, and 7 more are burning in hell at the well below.
This is my family story, and the violence must stop with me.
Hours left to complete recovery, uncountable.
7 years are ringing a bell, but the Lord above will save me from hell at the well below the valley. Oh, green grows a lily, oh, right among the bushes. Oh.